afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first event of 2022 in our Per Capita webinar series, in which we talk to the authors of really interesting and provocative books that have come across our desks in the last few months. I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by Abul Rizvi to talk about his essay in the National Interest series, Population Shock. Before I introduce Abul, just a bit of housekeeping. Firstly, before the housekeeping, of course, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you all from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and thank them for the custodianship of the land and waters on which myself and my family live. This series of Per Capita events, as I said, will be happening regularly throughout the year. We've got another one in a couple of weeks, but we're very chuffed to have Abul kick off our series today. If you have questions for Abul at the end of the presentation, we'll certainly have some time to do so. Please put your questions in the chat and I will endeavour to get to as many of them as I can while we're having that conversation towards the end of our time together today. Abul, of course, has written this book at a very important time in our history, when we have had significant shocks to our economy, to our immigration program, to our population, that are only going to continue. A little bit about Abul before I throw to him. He's an economics and public policy graduate from the ANU and recently completed his PhD in population and immigration policy. And from 1995 to 2007, he managed Australia's migration program. He commissioned work on the demographic, economic and budgetary impact of immigration that was extensively used in policy development, including in Australia's first intergenerational report in 2002, which he will talk about, I'm sure, as we go through this book. Abul and I worked together when he was, after his time at immigration, in the Department of Communications in Canberra, and I was one of those pesky political staffers in a minister's office. So we go back at least 15 years, I think now, and it's very good to have you with us here today. So over to you, Abul. I'll let you take our audience through what is, I have to say, a really, really terrific read. It flows beautifully. I was teasing Abul before we started that I didn't know he could write such poetry. It certainly wasn't in his ministerial briefings, but I suspect that was the rules of the public service. Over to you, Abul.
Thank you very much, Emma. And I must say, I enjoyed our whole time working together. You were not one of those evil staffers that was overbearing, but someone who listened and we were able to collaborate. So Emma is not one of your normal ministerial staffers by any means. Okay, population shock, 100 years that changed the world. The fundamental premise of the book is that economic policy, both before the boomers were born, during the life cycle of the boomers, and after the boomers have passed away, will be fundamentally different, both before the boomers were born and once the boomers pass away. And that's really what the focus of the book is. So I'll just go through some slides that go to that issue. So the book looks at or breaks up that 100-year population shock into the 4 stages of the life cycle of the baby boomers. The boomers in childhood, when we had extraordinarily strong rising rates of private consumption. Apparently bringing up kids is expensive. And we had weak workforce growth. We had weak workforce growth predominantly because the working age to population ratio at that point was falling because of a surfeit of kids. Stage 2 is the boomers in adulthood. Once again, strong private consumption growth. So once those boomers hit the workforce and started earning money, they too were spending strongly. And we had strong workforce growth because the boomers were pouring into the labour market. In Australia, even more so, because over that period, we'd also been running a very strong post-war migration program. So we had an incredible growth in the workforce during that period. Stage 3 is once the boomers are in old age, which is where we are now. Weak private consumption growth and weak workforce growth. Stage 4, a stage we've not yet reached, and possibly Australia may not reach for quite some time yet, is once the boomers have died out. There we look at shrinking private consumption and a declining workforce. A declining workforce rolls off the tongue easily, but it's not something any of us have experienced, probably in our lives. The way I divide up the 4 stages is to look at it in terms of a ratio. That is the ratio of people of working age, that is people between the ages of 15 to 64. And I use that because it's the most easily internationally comparable ratio that you can get a hold of. Yes, you could use different ratios, but you wouldn't get good enough data. So I've been driven to that by the data. So this graph tracks the working age to population ratio of 4 nations. 2 very similar nations, Australia and Canada, and 2 other very similar but dissimilar from us nations, China and Japan. How are they predominantly dissimilar? Well, China and Japan have very little immigration. Australia and Canada have lots. And what immigration does to the working age population ratio is essentially 2 things. Firstly, you can see how rapidly the China line, the black line, rises. That's the baby boomers in China pouring into workforce age and pouring into the workforce. And then once we get to about 2010, China's working age to population ratio then falls, and falls quite steeply. You'll see the Japanese line, the red one, also falls equally steeply. That's a function of a lack of immigration. If you compare the falls for Australia and Canada, the declines are much more gradual. And that is the tempering effect of immigration on the population and the age structure. Fundamentally, what immigration does is make the adjustment to a rapidly falling working age to population ratio a little easier to adjust to. Not easy, but easier to adjust to because it's not falling as rapidly. In the late 60s and 70s, women changed the world. And they changed the world in some fairly dramatic ways, in ways that will mean what we have experienced in the 100-year population shock will never happen again. It was a unique period in human history. The world changed firstly because of the pill. Widespread availability of the pill changed everything. Secondly, women started to go into higher education. Prior to the 1960s, very few women went into higher education. From the 60s onwards, the rate of women going into higher education has just continuously increased to the stage where now I think women are more representative in universities than men. Thirdly, having acquired higher education, women demanded careers. They wanted jobs, they wanted fulfilling jobs, and they wanted to climb the greasy pole. Admittedly, there's more to go, but that's what they wanted to do. And finally, we saw the emergence of double income families. What that did, the combination of those 4 factors, was drive fertility rates down. And they have driven fertility rates down forever. This idea, the United Nations tends to put this idea out that, oh no, this is just a phase we're going through and fertility rates will rise again. Ask any career-minded woman and she'll tell you, I don't think so, mate. So what happened as a result of women changing the world in the 60s is this graph. And what it shows you is that from the 60s onwards, world population growth, both actual growth and projected growth, has declined and declined very, very steadily. The rate of decline forecast in this graph is based on assumptions used by the United Nations. And one of the assumptions the United Nations uses is that all of those countries with really low fertility rates will gradually see those fertility rates rise to 1.75 children per woman. Australia's fertility rate at the moment is 1.58 children per woman. China's fertility rate is about 1.3. Korea's fertility rate is about 0.98. I think the UN people making these assumptions are dreaming if they think those fertility rates are going to rise to the level they're imagining. But if they don't, the decline that you see in that graph becomes much, much steeper. So what happened when, let's go back to the point where the baby boomers start entering the labour market. That's from around the late 60s and 70s. And governments had to respond fundamentally to two things. One, massively increasing workforce participation. And secondly, really strong private consumption growth. All of those women entering the labour market were earning wages and then wanted to spend the money. So how did governments respond? Well, many of us will remember fight inflation first through very tight monetary policies, as Milton Friedman told us we must. We had to keep a lid on wages and reduce the power of unions because those wage increases were driving inflation up. We had to flatten income tax structures because people had to be given incentives to work harder. We increased consumption taxes because in those days, private consumption, or strongly rising from private consumption, was considered a bit of a worry. We reduced company taxes. We abolished, in many countries, particularly Australia, inheritance taxes. Not everyone's abolished inheritance taxes, but many of them have been significantly reduced. And we reduced tax on capital income, although some countries did increased taxes on capital incomes. And of course, in the Reagan and Thatcher years, we insisted on smaller government and increased privatisation. That may have been appropriate in the circumstances when the baby boomers were pouring into the labour market. But the question we must ask is, are all of those policies appropriate when the baby boomers are exiting the labour market? Secondly, are those policies appropriate when the baby boomers start to die out rapidly? Here's a look at a topical issue, and that's inflation. Whilst it wasn't the only factor driving inflation in the 60s and 70s, the rapid increase in private consumption growth, the rapid increase in wages, the rapid increase in the workforce undoubtedly contributed to consumer prices rising rapidly. Subsequently, the actions taken by governments around the world have driven inflation down. But to some degree, the inflation has been driven down by demography. If we compare the consumer price index of Australia and Japan, Australia is the yellow line, Japan is the grey line, you can see Japan's consumer price index falls much earlier and remains much lower for much longer than Australia's. I contend that is fundamentally due to Japan ageing faster and entering the period when deaths exceed births earlier, and reaching a point where population in Japan is now shrinking at about 500,000 per annum. It will shrink at a faster rate over the next 10 to 20 years. And if anyone tells you the Japanese aren't worried about that, they're kidding themselves. I talked to the Japanese policymakers in this regard a couple of years ago, and they are worried as hell. The other extraordinary thing that the policies of the 1970s triggered was a dramatic fall in the portion of GDP going to labour compared to capital. It fell in the US, it fell in Australia, it fell in the OECD, albeit across the whole of the OECD, it started from a lower base, but the decline was everywhere, simply because the policies we pursued from the 70s onwards was designed to reduce the labour share of income. Lo and behold, policy did what was intended. But that has consequences. It has consequences once we reach the ageing stage and private consumption expenditure is weak. Driving down the labour share of income doesn't seem all that useful policy. So what does the third stage of the population shock look like? That is when people like me are old. Well, we spend less. And it is true. My wife and I spend less. And if you look at the ABS statistics, older people spend less. Growth of the workforce slows and eventually turns. Wages growth is low, and we have rising wealth inequality. We have weak business investment because private consumption growth is weak. Why would a business invest in expanding productive capacity if the outlook is for continuously weak private consumption? Unless they've got some whiz-bang idea by which they're going to grab huge amounts of market share, you'd be pretty nervous about investing if you were a business. You have lower productivity growth. An older population is less productive. And we have intense pressure on government budgets, fundamentally because older people pay less taxes but require more services. Let me just put this into some more hard numbers around this. So what this table compares is the 15 years prior to each of these nations reaching their working age to population ratio peak and the period after that peak. Now, each of these nations reached that peak at different points in time. In fact, it's surprising how wide the range is of the points in time that these nations peaked. Japan peaked relatively early, around the 1990s. Australia, Canada, the USA peaked much later, predominantly because of immigration. So we are comparing different periods of time, but we're comparing the same demographic characteristics. So prior to the working age to population ratio peaking, the so-called demographic dividend phase of a country's demography, per capita household consumption was very strongly growing. Those people were still spending money at a very rapid rate. Many of them would probably still had kids, I suspect, and were spending money on the family. Look at it once the working age to population ratio falls, and you can see private consumption falls off very rapidly. Older people spend less money. It's no more complicated than that. On average, you know, there are old people who undoubtedly do spend a lot of money, but there aren't as many of them. And that has a flow-on impact to real GDP growth. Prior to the working age population ratio peaking, in the 15 years prior to that, strong real GDP growth. In the period after the working age population ratio peaks, real GDP growth falls away. Just looking at it from a budget perspective, fundamentally, older people pay less tax. So the blue line at the top there is couples under the age of 65 and the income taxes they pay, compared to the brown line there, which is couples over the age of 65 and the income tax they pay. In other words, people like me don't pay much tax. Similarly, for lone households, you can see the comparison. I haven't got couples in there with kids because people like me don't have many kids at home at this age, at this stage of life. And so we don't actually track, the ABS doesn't actually track old people with kids, with young kids anyway. That was the third stage we've just talked about. I want to now talk about the fourth stage. The fourth stage is when deaths exceed births. Now, that's an unusual phenomenon in human history. Very rarely have we had extensive periods where deaths have exceeded births. You may have to go back to the Black Plague or things like that when that's happened. But generally, that is rare in human history. And it's certainly rare in human history that nations face the prospect of deaths increasingly exceeding births for the foreseeable future. We have really only one nation, one or two nations, that are in that fourth stage amongst developed nations at the moment. One's Japan, another's, interestingly, Russia. Very topical at the moment. But by the 2030s, we will have at least 23 developed nations where deaths exceed births. And they're looking at the prospect where deaths increasingly exceed births. So the margin between the two grows unless they have immigration, which many of these nations will find difficult to accept. But that doesn't stop there. as you go forward into the projections, you'll find more and more countries get added to the group where deaths exceed births. Australia will probably be the last developed nation reaching the point where deaths exceed births, predominantly because of immigration, but it will happen. There is no sensible level of immigration you can imagine that's going to stop that. Well before the end of this century, we'll have reached that point. But we will probably be the last of the developed nations to reach that point. This is China. China is, of course, the most interesting nation in terms of demography because they've done more silly things with demography than anybody else. The one-child policy was an unmitigated disaster. And the relevant Chinese ministry is so embarrassed by that fact that they keep trying to hide the consequences of what they did. But fundamentally what they did was imbalance the population to an extraordinary degree where the number of males in the population of China significantly exceeds the number of females. And as a result, as you go forward with a low fertility rate and a very aged population full of males, it's pretty obvious what happens. You gradually die out. Males don't reproduce. That decline in the working age population of China, you can see the rate of increase, which is based on actual data. The decline is based on forecasts. Once again, we've got the UN's assumption that fertility rates in China will rise. There's no evidence that's going to happen. In Australia, we recognised this in the late 90s. And we decided that the best way to address this, decided the best way to address this would be to increase the level of migration, of permanent migration of young people. Interestingly, one of the big changes we made was to encourage young students to come to Australia, and we created for them a pathway to permanent migration. The rate of increase in that skill stream there that you can see in that graph is primarily driven by overseas students becoming permanent residents. The decline is then Australia tightening that policy, and also a silly thing the government did, which was to create a backlog of partner visas, Australians who had married people from overseas. And then a couple of years ago, the government worked out that was illegal, so they stopped doing it. But then they had to clear the backlog. And hence the skill stream falls even faster and the family stream rises to deal with the backlog. Luckily, the backlog will probably be cleared by the end of this financial year. So what was the result of doing that for Australia? Well, it gave us the youngest population in the developed world. That is unequivocally a good thing. It gave us the largest portion of overseas born in the developed world, of any major developed country anyway. Now, people will debate whether that's a good thing or not. They can have their view on that. And we certainly had the fastest growing population in the developed world prior to COVID, all due to immigration. Once again, people will debate whether all those things are good or bad, but that's what they did. But that's what the policy did. From about 2008-9, we started to experience real aging. And aging, the best way to measure aging, in my view, is to count the number of retirees in the population. And you can see from around 2009, when our working age to population ratio peaked, the retirees start to grow. This is the stock of retirees in the economy. Currently growing at about 80 to 90,000 per annum. And as the 2020s progress, the number of retirees in the population will rise. The number of retirees in the population relative to the rest of the population will grow. That ratio will rise. And that will drive enormous expenditure requirements in terms of health, aged care, etc. And as we saw from the graph on income tax, per capita income tax will be weaker as we have more and more retirees. Thomas Piketty said on population ageing, and he argued population ageing was one of the key drivers of inequality, because he said inequality rises when economic growth is less than the return on capital. If you take the return on capital as one indicator of the return on capital is the rate of return on superannuation income, over the last 10 years, the rate of return on superannuation income has been about 8% per annum. Economic growth has not been anywhere near 8% per annum. And hence, using his measure, inequality must have increased. And it's always good for an economist to go back to John Maynard Keynes. And he said in 1937 that with a stationary population, and he didn't consider the idea of a declining population, which is what we must now consider, we would be absolutely dependent for the maintenance of prosperity and civil peace on policies of increasing consumption by a more equal distribution of incomes. Driving down private consumption is no longer a good idea, even if it may have been a good idea in the 80s. So what should Australia do? Well, firstly, we've got to start addressing the rising inequality to strengthen aggregate demand. I'm surprised we don't talk more about inequality, especially coming up to the next election. Inequality is important. I know, floods and bushfires and COVID and all that's also important, and no doubt submarines are important. But in my view, addressing inequality is as important as any of those. We should look to slow the rate of population ageing, and we can do that by supporting young families to prevent a further decline in our fertility rate. It's already at the lowest level we've ever had. We don't want it to go much lower. We need sensible immigration and settlement policies, and we do need to plan for a much larger, older population. Us baby boomers will be sticking around for another 20, 30 years, so you're going to have to put up with us, and somebody's going to have to look after us. Well-managed immigration will be essential. The government has assumed long-term net migration of 235,000 per annum. That's the highest level of net migration any intergenerational report has assumed, but the intergenerational report is completely devoid of the question, how are you going to do that? What's the plan? No one knows, because apparently Treasury says it's Home Affairs' responsibility to work that out, and Home Affairs says, well, we don't work those targets out, it's not our business. So neither of those two organisations own that 235 figure in terms of delivery. We are rapidly becoming a low-skilled guest worker society. Is that a good idea? I don't think so, because every country in the world that's decided to use low-skilled guest workers has created enormous problems, levels of exploitation that are just horrible. Guest work, over the last 6 or 7 years, we've had probably the biggest surge of unsuccessful asylum seekers in our history ever. Yet we don't want to talk about it. Most of those asylum seekers pick fruit. They live in the shadows. They are heavily exploited. And we just turn away. What the government has allowed to happen in the last 6 or 7 years with asylum seekers, in my view, is utterly appalling. I saw Mr. Dutton talking about defeating people smugglers again this morning, and I thought, mate, they've pulled the wool over your eyes. You have no idea what was happening. We've had a massive increase in the number of bridging visas, while investment in compliance has declined. Our visa system is in gridlock. Here's some policy principles for immigration that I would suggest we adopt. I think we should reaffirm Bob Hawke's commitment to a non-discrimination in the permanent migration program. We've started to abandon that. We need to minimise the number of people in immigration limbo. They're not just people who are unlawful, but they're essentially people on temporary visas who are stuck. They can't either leave and they can't get permanent residence. We've got to stop that. We've got to commit to more efficient and timely visa processing. This idea that Dutton had that if you process visas more slowly, you punish more people and that's a good thing, is just balmy. What it does is punish the genuine and reward the unscrupulous. And I'm happy to show him how that works, because we've known that for 30 years. We need to process partner and dependent child visas on a demand-driven basis. Why? Well, firstly, because it's the right thing to do. It's morally the right thing to do. But if Mr. Dutton has a problem with that, the law actually requires that. He was breaking the law when he was not processing partner visas on a demand-driven basis. We need to provide permanent protection for genuine refugees, because the alternative is to leave them in limbo forever. That's not good for anything. And we do need to get into genuinely transparent consultation on migration and population policy, not political slogans, which we've been into for so long now. I've probably taken longer than I should have, Emma, but I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
No, not at all. Thank you, Abul. And if you can stop sharing your screen, that would be great, but it's not.
Okay.
Well done. So thank you very much for that fascinating presentation of your equally fascinating book. I'm going to go to questions. We've got quite a few in the chat and the Q&A. But before we do, a couple of things I wanted you to dive into more deeply. You said you'd be happy to take Peter Dutton through why his approach to asylum seekers and managing people smugglers was having the opposite outcome to that which he pretends he has. Can you expand on that a little bit for us?
Yeah. So his focus was entirely on boat arrivals. Boat arrivals had largely stopped under Kevin Rudd Mark II. Most people don't realise that. But the job was virtually done when Kevin Rudd did what he did in terms of offshore processing.
Yep.
And the evidence for that is in the numbers. Mr. Morrison cleaned up the end of it with turnbacks. But he was turning back relatively few boats, even though he's got a trophy for it. But what happened after that was that people who were organising labour to be trafficked into Australia via aeroplanes, which is actually much more efficient than bringing them in on a leaky boat, were able to do that, and there was no response from the government. Even though we knew how these scams work, the government just didn't respond. In about 2015-16, we had a massive increase in people smuggled in from Malaysia to pick fruit in Australia. They were people there was organisers behind all of that. It doesn't happen on its own. It requires organisers to bring the people in on visitor visas, apply for asylum, take them through the system and farm them out. Shouldn't say farm that, allocate them to farmers around Australia to pick fruit. We have at the moment around 95,000 asylum seekers in the country. 30,000 of them have been refused at both the primary stage and both at the primary stage and at the review stage. They are now effectively undocumented. They do not have work rights, and they are extraordinarily vulnerable. And yet we, as a country, as a government, as a population, sit there and think, oh, it's all right. We get cheap apples.
And it's effectively really, we're going to end up in the situation that America's in, with a whole heap of undocumented migrants, then their children that have been born here have never known any other life, which really has led to a permanent underclass of working people in that country. Not something any Australian ever agreed to or wanted, as far as I know.
Absolutely. I don't think anyone wants that. Yet we have a situation where the National Party and the National Farmers Federation is saying bringing in more people to work on picking fruit on farms is a good idea. Really?
Yeah.
Have we worked this out?
It's a really complex issue, of course, because we don't want to be paying a lot more for fresh food. Then we don't want, that contributes to inequality as well. The one thing that no one ever brings up in this conversation, though, is the obscene profits made by our supermarket duopoly, and the way that they control those prices. So again, these aren't things that are insurmountable with good policy, are they?
No, they're not. No, they're not. Although the world shows us it's hard.
Yes.
Policy in this space is hard. Every country in the world that has gone down this path has made a dog's breakfast of it.
It's incredibly challenging, and not just on a practical level, but emotionally, and with a country with a history like Australia's of the White Australia policy, which of course was defended for years as a policy that was intended to protect wages.
Yes.
It's very difficult to have this conversation. But I think as you said, it's the workers themselves that are being exploited. It's the immigrant workers themselves that are being exploited, and we shouldn't tolerate that So
No.
expanding on that. Before I do go to questions, because we've got quite a lot, I just wanted to raise one more issue. And you said it is difficult to talk about inequality in Australia and we don't pay enough attention to it. Of course, you're talking to the think tank for inequality. It's our entire raison d'etre here at Per Capita, so I'm thrilled when people want to talk about it. You suggest some, and you brought up the Keynes quote, which I love as well. We really need to rediscover and to take out the idea that redistribution, economic redistribution, is a dirty word. I remember appearing before a Senate inquiry into the stage 3 tax cuts some time ago, and was talking simply about the use of our tax and transfer system and how it operates. And one of the current front bench ministers leaned forward to me at the time and said in a horrified voice, "Are you a redistributionist?" Which I found quite staggering, because our entire tax and transfer system is redistributionist, is it?
Exactly, that's what we do. That's what governments do.
So have you got any tips for us at Per Capita on how to break through that and have bolder conversations about inequality and redistributive policies?
Oh, look, this is about communicating to the Australian population, and I'm certainly no expert in how to communicate to the Australian population. But there are some basic facts that the Australian population is not picking up and is not hearing enough. And I think that graph, the graph is actually from the RBA, it's not from me, of the decline in the labour share of income, is a graph that every Australian should have imprinted on their brain in terms of policy in this space. The fact that we don't have an inheritance tax is unusual. You know, most of the OECD has an inheritance tax, and I'm not talking about an inheritance tax on the ordinary mum and dad, but an inheritance tax would help.
Yes, well, that Jan Simpson in our chat actually asked us you to expand on that issue, and I would like to talk about that a bit. Of course, we had at the last election a terrible scare campaign about a death tax, which was completely invented off the back of various other changes. I agree with you, and most rational people do agree that in a country that is, in most developed countries now, where we've seen so much more wealth in capital and accruing to fewer and fewer people, that some form of inheritance tax on the wealthy is essential. What level do you think how can we have that conversation in Australia? Previously, inheritance taxes were levied by the states. That was, the rush to get rid of them was kicked off by the LQ Peterson. But if we are going to talk about sustainability and inequality in the future, what we're seeing, I think my theory is a lot of individual households practicing their own intergenerational redistribution, but leaving out the general population. But as you say, we're not talking about mum and dads here. We're talking mums and dads with, an average suburban home. We're talking about people with estates of, 3 million plus, maybe.
Yes. Exactly, and that would need to be clarified. And I mean, fundamentally, we run a superannuation system, and now, which does favour people with very large superannuation balances, who get very minimal tax applied to very large superannuation balances. Is that really a good thing? All right, if we're going to stick with that, surely the benefits of that minimal taxation on that very large superannuation balance should, at least when the person passes away, be appropriately taxed.
Yeah.
Without that, it just doesn't make any sense to me. The other thing that we don't talk enough about is when we do double the number of people over the age of 80 in the population, what will our health and aged care system look like then? And how are we going to pay for it? There's nothing that talks about that. In terms of the second stage tax cuts, I remember in the 2019 budget, the second stage tax cuts were justified as affordable because we were going to have this massive increase in economic growth that was going to pay for everything. So we could afford it. Well, we're not forecasting that massive increase in economic growth anymore, but we're still going to have the tax cuts. Really?
And they're now bipartisan policy.
Yes. I find that very disappointing.
So do I. So I'm just going to move to some other questions now. I think there's an interesting one here in the chat from Peter Davison, who's with us from ACOS. which, Peter, just let me find your question, because you do talk about the shift that was made around 2001 to encourage working holiday makers and student visa who would then acquire skills here in the country and go on to build a life here. Yes. Peter asks, should backpacker and student visas be capped? If so, how might that work? And if not, how can the temporary migrant worker exploitation be contained given the scale of the problem?
Yes, a couple of things here. The media reporting on the exploitation of working holiday makers is much more intense than I believe the size of the problem in terms of working holiday makers, whereas the reporting of the exploitation of asylum seekers and Pacific Island workers is much less than what is actually taking place, predominantly because the working holiday makers are surprisingly good at social media and being able to tell you about their exploitation, including taking pictures of it, whereas the asylum seekers and the Pacific Islanders are in a position where they can't afford to say anything. They're in trouble if they say anything, and so they don't. And as a result, the media reports what it gets given. And so we hear a lot more about the working holiday maker exploitation than we hear about the other sorts of exploitation, which in my view is probably significantly worse. What can we do about it? Well, in 2019, Alan Fels did a very good report on what we should do about it, including much stronger legislation penalising exploitation. At the moment, I haven't seen any employer go to jail when they exploited a worker to the tune, or workers to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. You just get a slap on the wrist and say, "Oh, don't do that again." Oh, okay. Hang on. If the same worker went to Woolies and pinched stuff off the shelf, they'd bring the cops. But when Woolies underpays their workers, the CEO gets, "Oh, never mind. It's okay."
Yeah, it's it is a galling double standard, isn't it? And I think, you know, the constant claims that people say, "Oh, but the awards are so complex."
Oh, yeah.
And it always comes from people that have managed to navigate every tax concession and squeeze every last dollar out of our complex tax concession system, but can't work out how to pay their workers.
Yes.
Take that as a comment. A question here from Janet McCullman. Abul, could you please comment on the effect of huge property values being locked into maintaining the wealth of the ageing at the expense of consumption and young people having affordable housing? It looks like a time bomb to Janet.
I would agree with that. And in my view, the policies that Bill Shorten took to the last election to try to reduce or the growth in house prices was countered with a scare campaign that house prices would fall enormously. You remember that?
Yes.
House prices would fall through the floor.
Absolutely.
And apparently that was a bad thing. Well, for people who own houses, it probably is a bad thing. But if you are interested in helping young people get into a house rather than supporting the size of the inheritance, you know, my wife and I pass on to our kids, which is probably not a priority, well, I wouldn't mind a slight reduction in house prices. It wouldn't bother me that much. I can't see how that's bad policy.
I can't see how it's, but we've to do a bit of self-promotion, we'll have a big report on the state of housing affordability coming out next month. And we make the point there, as many have made, that the only people that really benefit from runaway house price increases are investors. If you are out of not on the property market, or you're just an owner-occupier with one property, the price of your house might go up, but the next house you buy is going to go up as well. So we really have got a lot of those policy settings very wrong, I think. I'm going to just touch on a few more questions before I combine. There's a lot of people talking about one particular issue, which I'm going to combine into one big question at the end.
Okay.
But we've got a question in the chat from Cameron Murray, which I think is interesting. And he suggested, can you expand on the immigration and ageing and inequality links? Just having a look at the chart, or whatever Cameron's managed to pull up, I'm sure he's researching busily in the background. Japan seems more equal than Australia. Is immigration policy really a major factor, or is ageing a major factor?
I think ageing is the major factor in terms of rising inequality, and I go back to Piketty's equation.
Yeah.
If economic growth is significantly slower than the return on capital, then the people who own capital, and the vast bulk of people who own large amounts of capital are people like me, are making a lot more money without going to work than my daughters who go to work and have to earn an income on which they're taxed at a much higher rate.
Yeah. Well, I've been making the point to a lot of people. My in-laws, we lost my in-laws over the last couple of years, and having sold their house recently, just 5 years after they were quoted a price for it, it has more than doubled. And so that house that we sold has earned more on its just sitting there in the last 5 years per annum than my husband and I combined.
Wow.
So we have a significant, and,
Yes.
we're not low income earners, you know, we're both on, well, not massive salaries, but comfortable upper middle class salaries. So we have a significant.
Yes. If you own capital, you're very well off.
That's
and
right.
You're going to get a good return on that capital, and it'll grow at a much faster rate than your wages.
And as I've often pointed out, there are within generations that divide exists, the holders of capital and those without, but largely due to a lot of tax and transfer policies introduced since the mid-90s, we've favoured capital accumulation by older Australians.
Yep.
And so before I try and bundle up this last big question for you, I did just wanted to touch on the fact that I'm not an economist. People often make the mistake that I am, because I will talk, as you know,
sound like an economist.
Talk about anything. But we really are, as I think what your book makes clear, it is about population and ageing and the global population ageing, but you make very, very clear that the economic settings that were put in place at a time of abundance, of economic growth, of increasing population, increasing consumption, and also, I would say, abundant resources, are now being pushed and will not be allowed to die at a time when we have falling population, falling consumption, and huge disruption to resources, because we're shifting from abundant fossil fuel resources to more abundant renewable resources, but we haven't monetized that yet. What's it going to take to convince the economists that dominate our national debate that we need a fundamental shift in thinking? In your excellent book.
Yes. I'm not sure whether the fundamental shift is in relation to climate change, which I'll put to one side, because that fundamental shift, to some degree, we've reached the point where the fundamental shift, the market's taken care of now.
Sorry, yeah.
You know, it's all over Red Rover, whether you believe it or not, or in man-made climate change or not. Yeah. So I assume the fundamental shift we're talking about is acceptance or non-acceptance of immigration. Is that?
I think so. Yeah.
Is that so? It is the case that the bulk of Australians, 60, maybe 70%, I don't know what the percentage is, it depends on which polls you read, and different people do different polls on this, but 60 to 70% of Australians are against an increase in immigration. Two things about that. I doubt whether most of the people who are polled on that actually understand what the current level of immigration is and what an increase would look like. And for those who argue for a big cut in immigration, I find rarely do people understand what it is they're actually proposing to cut. Because when I raise a few examples, they say, oh, no, you wouldn't cut that. Oh, no, you wouldn't cut that. No, not that. And then you think, well, you've made up already, 60, 70, 80% of the migration program by the time you've excluded all of these things. So part of the problem is that I don't think we've done a very good job, despite being a migrant nation, of actually explaining immigration to our migrant nation. That would help, I think. Having said that, I look across at a country like Japan, which is shrinking at 500,000 per annum, and by the end of this decade will probably be shrinking by about 1 million per annum. If you survey the Japanese, they don't want any more immigration. And they haven't got any at all at the moment. And so, there is the challenge of trying to convince people about complex policy, especially around immigration. It's not easy because it raises all sorts of issues about the nature of society in the future. And we've always in Australia resisted the next wave of immigrants. We didn't like the Irish. They were no good. They were all papists. We then didn't like the Greeks and the Italians because they all had funny foods, and you know, we've always gone through those phases.
Every wave has brought a new form of the same objection. But of course, I think what we have now is as well, and this brings me to the issue that many people have raised in the chat, Shane, John Thompson, Don Cameron, and others, which is how we balance the need to continue an immigration program that will support reduce the ageing of our population and support growth, with the need to balance the impact we have on our ecological systems, and as Merelda said, also on our infrastructure systems. How can we? So I think this goes to a lot of concern about immigration on the left, of people that consider themselves welcoming and quite open to multicultural society, but are concerned about the impact on Australia's ecology of a greater population here. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that fits with the idea that, you know, it's the global population that drives climate change, and they're going to move here or they're going to live anyway? I'll let you answer that.
Just to put this into a broad demographic context, if we pursued a policy of, say, zero net migration, within about 10 years, deaths would exceed births. We would then continuously decline in our population size. We just can keep shrinking after that, because there's this view that once we reach the point where deaths equal births, everything stops there. It doesn't. Old people just keep dying in bigger and bigger numbers, and old people have few babies. So fundamentally, if you want to pursue that policy, you've got to then ask yourself, how would you manage the transition? What would you cut in terms of immigration? You've got all those questions you've got to deal with, because you can't just say, let's have zero net migration and it's achieved. It doesn't work like that. The alternative is to age slightly more gradually, have a slightly higher population before we start to decline slightly more slowly. They're the two alternatives, I think. Aging slightly more gradually enables you to adjust, you know, build a few more hospitals and aged care homes and all those things. Aging slightly more gradually means you maintain a level of income that enables you to afford many of the things you're going to need to manage that more aged population. If you switched to zero net migration and aged much, much faster, your ability to afford those things would be restricted. Indeed, your ability to afford things like appropriate investment in mitigating climate change and mitigating floods and et cetera, would be reduced. So what I'm saying is there are so many balls you've got to balance in this space. It's not a simple this or that approach. I saw the Business Council recently came out and said we ought to increase the migration program to 220,000 per annum, which would be 60,000 more than it is currently. It would be 30,000 more than we've ever had in our history. But I didn't see in the whole of the BCA website one word on how this would be achieved.
Funny that.
Some minion will work that out.
Someone will work that out. That's often the way with these very well-paid, very well-resourced lobby groups. They spend a lot of time telling us what they want, very little about how to do it, and about the wider impacts. I think it comes back again, doesn't it, to distribution?
Yes.
You know, I think if you look at books like Kate Raworth's Donut Economics and others, we do have to accept that globally we have probably hit a point where we can't extract many more of the world's resources without, you know, causing catastrophic damage, which has already been caused.
Yes.
But it's redistributing that income. So I, you know, am convinced, reading Raworth and others, that we can both degrow the aggregate consumption, but still lift the living standards of 99% of people on this planet.
Yes, absolutely.
Well,
absolutely.
Well, this book
Absolutely
tackles that question head on, and
Yeah.
I do recommend it to all of you. I've read, I think,
Hmm.
almost all of the books in the national interest series. This is one of my top picks. It's a terrific read on a really important issue, and a conversation that we find it very difficult to have in this country.
It is a difficult one. I wrote an article in The Conversation earlier this week looking at the BCA's proposal of 220,000 per annum.
Mm.
And rather than approaching it as whether that aggregate number is a good idea or not, I asked the question, well, assuming I was back in my old job and the Prime Minister said, the BCA is right, we need 220,000 per annum, how are we going to do it? I sat down and worked out, well, which categories could I increase?
Mm-hmm.
How much could I increase them by without creating all sorts of other problems?
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, I came to a figure that I couldn't do much more than 160,000 per annum without creating unacceptable risks in a range of areas. And so I got attacked by lots of people on the business side saying, oh, no, we can do a lot more than that. We can do a lot more than that. But none of them want to explain it. And it's the same as the people who say we want to cut it. You ask them, okay, would you allow Emma, if she married, Joe from overseas, to live with Joe in Australia? Oh, yeah, that seems fair. Well, you've just done 72,000 visas for a year.
Mm-hmm.
Would you allow Emma to bring her child to Australia? Oh, yeah, that seems, that's. Well, you've done another 5,000 visas. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're a rapidly aging population. The vast bulk of people now entering our health and aged care system tend to be migrants. Mm. Are you going to stop that? Are we going to stop the migration of nurses, aged care workers, doctors, etc., or are we going to need more of them?
A lot more on current projections.
And you work your way through each of the little bits and pieces, and you always get an answer saying, oh, no. And then you add it all up and you think, well, it doesn't come to the number you want then.
Evidence-based policy, Abul. I commend you for your long history of pursuing it, and on behalf of the Australian people, and setting out why it's so important in this space, in this book. So thank you again. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for a terrific contribution to an important debate.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you all for your questions and your engagement in the discussion. We do have a couple of, we now have a whole series of events coming up. So in a fortnight's time, actually on Wednesday the 23rd, we're talking to Saul Griffith about his book, The Big Shift, which answers some of those questions about how we maintain growth but also decarbonise the economy. That will be a terrific conversation. And a fortnight after that, another in the national series, interest series author Jo Dyer will be joining us to talk about her book, Burning Down the House, Reconstructing Modern Politics. She is, of course, the currently finishing up her last Adelaide Writers' Week over in Adelaide, which I couldn't get to, and I love it there. But and she is with an independent candidate for the seat of Boothby. Do join us for those events. This event has been recorded and will be posted on our usual Per Capita channels. Stay in touch with us. If you haven't signed up, I'm sure all of you have, or you wouldn't be here. You can do so on our website. We love these conversations. It's always good to see you all. Thank you again, Abul, and thank you all for coming today.